For most people in the Middle Ages, daily life was a relentless struggle for survival. Death was a constant companion, whether it came from disease, famine, or war. If you were a peasant, your days were a blur of hard labor, farming the land, or serving the local lord. Your food choices were incredibly limited, and staying alive often depended on whatever you could grow, gather, or barter. Bread was the most common thing you could buy, but even that could disappear during a bad drought or a famine. So what did medieval peasants actually eat to stay alive? Today, we're going to uncover the cheap, humble meals that kept them going through centuries of unimaginable hardship. Back in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people lived in small, rural villages. Europe was a patchwork of estates controlled by lords, monasteries, or other powerful institutions. And even among peasants, there was a pecking order. At the top, you had fremen, who might own or rent a small plot of land and maybe even earn a little money. But at the very bottom were the serfs. They were legally tied to both the lord and the land, forced to work not just for themselves but for their masters too. Others scraped by through different means, like keeping bees, weaving baskets, or gathering fuel and wild foods from the forests. But no matter their trade, almost all peasants were bound to the soil. For them, food wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about survival itself. One of the simplest and most common meals, especially when times were tough, was gruel. Just picture it, a thin, watery slop made by boiling cereals like oats, rye, or barley in water. If you were really lucky, maybe you'd get to use milk instead. Gruel was bland and pretty tasteless, more like a drink than a proper meal. Nutritionally, it offered very little. But, in desperate times, gruel had one huge advantage. A single handful of grain could be stretched into several bowls, feeding an entire family. During severe famines, peasants would even resort to grinding up chestnuts or acorns to make a crude version of gruel. Monasteries often served it to the sick or the elderly, and peasants would soak stale bread into the mixture just to make it a bit more filling. It might not have been delicious, but for countless people, gruel was the difference between life and death. Now, when you think of medieval peasant food, one dish probably comes to mind: pottage. The name comes from Old French and literally just means food cooked in a pot. And that's exactly what it was. Pottage was a thick stew made from whatever ingredients were on hand: vegetables, beans, grains, herbs, and on a very rare occasion, a tiny scrap of meat or fish. What made pottage so brilliant was its flexibility. The pot could be kept simmering over the fire for days, with new ingredients tossed in whenever they became available. Turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans were common additions. Sometimes, breadcrumbs or even egg yolks were used to thicken the broth. Interestingly, even cookbooks from the 14th century, like the Foam of Cury, which was compiled by King Richard II as master cooks, had fancy versions of pottage. Their recipes called for things like cabbage, saffron, and onions, or even sweetened versions made with apples, almond milk, honey, and spices. But for the average peasant, it was much simpler. Pottage was the ultimate survival food. It changed day by day, but one thing was constant. It was cheap, it was filling, and it was perfect for getting them through long, grueling hours of labor. Bread was the absolute foundation of the medieval diet. Rich or poor, everyone ate it every single day. But the type of bread you ate was a dead giveaway of your social status. Wealthy nobles enjoyed soft, fluffy white loaves made from finely milled wheat flour. Peasants, on the other hand, had to make do with dark, coarse bread made from rye, barley, or oats. Rye bread was especially common among the poor. Rye is a tough grain. It can grow in poor soil and survive harsh winters. While it didn't rise as nicely as wheat, it provided the essential calories needed for heavy farm work. Often, thick slices of this bread, called trenchers, were used as plates. Stews or pottage would be piled right on top, and once the main meal was gone, the sauce-soaked trencher could be eaten too. In wealthy households, leftover trenchers were often given to beggars or even to the dogs. In places like England, there were even laws regulating bread production to try and keep it affordable for the poor. A loaf had to be sold for a penny, but its size would shrink in years when the harvest was bad. In the worst of times, some peasants even had to eat horse bread, which was made from ground peas, beans, and bran stuff originally meant for animal feed. It was coarse, heavy, and tasted sour, but it filled an empty stomach. While wheat was expensive and seen as a status symbol, oats were the grain of the common people. Oats grew well in almost any soil, which made them affordable and reliable. They could be eaten in a bunch of different ways: stirred into pottage, baked into simple flat oat cakes, or boiled into porridge. Oatcakes were especially useful for laborers out in the fields. Made with nothing more than ground oats, water, and a pinch of salt, they could be cooked on flat stones over a fire. No oven needed. Scottish soldiers were even known to carry flat stones with them on campaigns. They'd heat the stones in the fire, pour some oat batter on top, and quickly bake up some pancakes to fuel them. Luscious, cheap, portable, and packed with calories, oats were truly the medieval survival food. But throughout the Middle Ages, famine was a recurring nightmare. A single bad harvest could spell disaster for thousands. One of the worst periods was between 1315 and 1317, when relentless rains ruined crops all across Europe. To make matters worse, a cattle disease wiped out herds, with as many as 80% of all livestock perishing. With no grain and no meat, mass starvation set in. Chronicles from the time describe absolutely horrifying scenes. People stripped bark from trees, dug up roots, and boiled weeds just to have something to eat. Some even resorted to cannibalism. An Irish account from that period states that desperate people dug up corpses from cemeteries and ate the flesh from the skulls. In the darkest of times, it was said that some mothers even ate their own children. It was the ultimate, horrifying price of survival and a grim reminder of just how fragile life really was. Cheap meals like gruel, pottage, rye bread, and oat cakes might sound humble to us today, but for medieval peasants, they were lifelines. These foods provided just enough energy to keep their bodies going through endless days of back-breaking labor. They fueled the plowing of fields, the harvesting of crops, and the constant toil under the watchful eye of a lord. Though these meals were coarse and unrefined, they carried the immense weight of survival. In a world where famine could strike at any moment, the ability to stretch a handful of oats or a single cabbage into a meal meant everything. So, the next time you sit down to eat a hearty stew, a slice of rustic bread, or even a simple bowl of porridge, take a moment to remember the medieval peasants who survived on these very foods not by choice, but out of absolute necessity. For them, these cheap meals weren't about flavor or enjoyment. They were about life itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from history. See you next time.